Welcome to the Resistor Vic podcast, my third episode. I know my second episode, the sound wasn't all that great, but hey, I'm learning, right? My guest today is a retired high school band teacher, a former congressional candidate, and an award-winning author with four books.
Five. Bookseller was
Five
my fifth
books.
book. Yeah.
Fifth books. We're going to talk with Bob Seay about his latest book, The Bookseller's Son. Welcome, Bob.
Hey, Vic. How you doing? Good to see you.
So let's tell everybody how you and I met. When I ran for Congress in 2014, Bob was one of my campaign volunteers, one of my best and most stalwart campaign volunteers. He drove all over the state with me. And then that unfortunately didn't work out. I have to go down in history as the guy that lost to Ken Buck. And Bob took up the mantle in 2016. Was it as much fun for you as it was for me?
You know, I have to say I loved that job. If you look at being a candidate as a job, I loved that gig. You know,
Yeah.
I lost. I mean, I tell people that 2 out of 3 voters felt like I should keep on being a band director. You know, I wished it had turned out the other way, but we had a message, we got it out, and I think that we made some influence. We just fortunately didn't persuade the people who were already out there.
Yeah. Well, that district, I mean, because who's the representative now?
Lauren Boebert.
Yeah. And before she was your representative, because of redistricting, I'm not in that district anymore. But before she was yours, she was mine. So we've got that in common too.
It's actually worse than that, Vic. I mean, yes, they redistricted and whatever, but Boebert knew, she could see the handwriting on the wall, that she was going to get beat in CD3. I mean, that was coming because people of CD3 were fed up with her. And so she came over here, just classic carpetbagger kind of thing, moved into the district and ran for CD4. Doesn't know jack about CD4 issues, but, you know.
That would require her reading.
That would require a functional brain.
So you're in a really red part of the district. How does she play out there?
She was out here a few weeks ago. And, you know, they love her. She's got that Fox News girl look. And honestly, I think that's probably where half of her voters come from. They would ask her softball questions like, are you going to seek justice for whatever that clerk was that got in trouble?
Tina Peters.
Tina Peters, you know, are you going to do that? And they were lobbing all these softball questions to her. You know, I asked her when she was going to stand up to Trump and hold him accountable for his crimes, and she didn't like that question. So
you mean they didn't have you escorted out at that point?
No, but she shut the meeting down 30 minutes early.
Imagine that.
Yeah, she kept saying, we have a mandate. And I said, you won by less than 1% in an election where, you know, only 30% of the voters stayed home. You know, it's hardly a mandate. Clearly, these people can't do math because you just look at the budget, you can see that. But they don't understand certain definitions, mandate being one of them.
Funny how Republicans have a funny definition of mandate.
They have a funny definition of everything.
Yeah. But the main part of your life, before you were a political candidate, you were a high school band teacher.
Yes, it was. And choir director. I taught band, choir, and guitar classes.
Nice. And you did that you retired from that 1 or 2 years ago?
I just finished my first year of retirement. So a year ago, I guess. Yeah.
Do you miss it?
Every day. I loved my gig. I know I just said that about being a candidate too. I've just been really fortunate. I really did like that gig. I quit because I wanted to be able to still hear conversations. You know, an occupational hazard of being a band director is that you go deaf eventually. So I quit before it was becoming noticeable. It was getting noticeable. And I had taught for 40 years. And so all those things combined, I just felt like, okay, it's time to hang it up, you know, pass it on to somebody else.
I taught for 1 year after the campaign. My first job was a middle school math teacher in Walsenburg. And I absolutely loved being a teacher. Teaching didn't love me. The kids were great. The administrators, no.
Yeah, I
So,
always thought I'd want to teach at an orphanage with an off-campus administration. You know,
ooh, that would work.
yeah,
Yeah.
that could work.
All right. But the main thing we're here to talk about tonight is your latest book, The Bookseller's Son, your fifth book. And real quick, what were your other four?
The first one was called The Band Room, which is still the most political thing I've ever written, and in fact, in a roundabout way, led to the inspiration for The Bookseller's Son. The second
How's
one was
that?
Dad, which
Talk
deals.
about that for a minute. How did that lead to The Bookseller's Son?
Okay, I would always give a copy of my book to our high school library. So we had four of them in there. We had The Band Room, we had Dad, and then the two Gabriella Allegri mysteries that I wrote. And the kids enjoyed checking them out, especially the band kids, the choir kids enjoyed checking those out. And one day I went into the library and the band room was missing. It has a lot of political stuff in it. It addresses LGBTQ issues. It addressed Black Lives Matter. The villain was a coach. He was basically a Trump proxy. And so when the book came up missing, I asked the librarian, what happened to this book? She didn't know. Nobody knew. Nobody could tell me. And so I don't know if it was removed or if it was just, checked out and never taken back or what happened. But that made me think, okay, what does it feel like to have a book censored? What is it like to have a book banned? And then I started looking at all the stuff that's going on in Florida and Iowa and Texas. Those are like the big three. It's happening everywhere. But those at that time, about a year ago, in fact, were the big three that were doing that. And that's where I started writing the book, The Bookseller's Son.
And which of your books did you receive some awards for?
The Band Room and Dad. Dad was the Colorado Authors League winner for their literary book for 22, I believe it was 2022. Yeah, because I published it in 21, so it would have been 22 when it won that award.
Nice. And was that about you and your dad, or?
I took the three worst things that ever happened to me: losing my job, going through a divorce, and watching my dad go through the early stages of Alzheimer's. And I layered them together as if they happened all at the same time. And so the guy in the story is like in his 40s, but it's in a lot of ways, it's a coming of age story. He's kind of estranged from his father. So this is a get back together with dad kind of a thing. And it's also a big personal growth thing, for the character in the story. I know it sounds incredibly depressing. Oh, you're writing a book about Alzheimer's, which, yeah, that's a depressing topic. But I like to think that the book is overall uplifting. I know the ending I'm really proud of, and people have commented about how the ending really affected them. So I'm proud of that book.
You notice how I keep delaying my review of your book?
You're just hanging me out there, Vic.
I am. All right, so here's my review of The Bookseller's Son. And if I remember, folks, I will put a link to it, to the Amazon link for where you can get it. All right. First, the bad, Bob. Page 150 was extraneous.
Page
and I found
150.
page 150, one page.
One page was extraneous. Okay.
And I found two, maybe three grammatical errors, but I remember you talked about how frustrating it was after you had it edited, and then you go through it and you still find a couple. They were tiny, tiny little errors. Other than that, I've got to say, the way I judge books when I read them, one, I either force myself to finish, because once I start reading a book, I finish reading a book, whether it's great or horrible. I finish reading it. Stephen King's The Tommyknockers, one of the worst books I ever read, but I struggled all the way through it. On the other hand, The Stand, one of the few books that I've read multiple times. But one of the ways that I remember books or judge a book is, a week later, do I still remember the characters? And right now I can tell you that the primary characters are Jeremiah and Teresa. And the parents are harder for me because they weren't in it very much. But I can still visualize it, and Teresa's mom. And So the book, why don't you give a synopsis about what the book is about before I go on?
The book is about this guy who he grows up in his parents' bookstore, and it's set in rural Arkansas in the 1970s. And there are a couple of reasons I chose that setting, but that's where it's at. So he's growing up in this bookstore, and the bookstore is known for its display that's called Books That Deserve to Be Read. And they've taken all these banned books and gathered them together, and that's what the store is known for. His parents retire, and so he's left with he's going to be the manager of this bookstore. When I was writing the book, I referred to it as the Lion King in a bookstore, because he goes through this whole bit about, am I responsible for my parents' legacy? How much of this do I want to do? Do I even believe the same things that they believe in? And so a lot of the book is Jeremiah's struggle with coming to terms with how he feels about censorship and how he's going to manage that. Then Millicent Spate, who is the villain of this, who was modeled after a woman here in Lamar, actually.
Really?
Oh, yeah. I'm not going to say that name for a couple of
Or
reasons.
if I know her.
You actually, I don't know if you do or not. You might have run into her during your campaign.
Okay. Say
anyway,
no more.
We used to
I'll
call her
ask you
Crazy
later.
Common Core Lady because she was always arguing at the school about Common Core stuff. That's how I met her, was during that argument. She was a big part of the movement to against Polis a few years ago, to recall Polis. So anyway, she is a big book banning, censorship kind of person, and so she wants to challenge these books in the school library, and then she wants to go to the public library. And ultimately,
we're talking about Millicent now, and not the gal in your town.
Yes, correct. I should thank you for that correction. Anyway, Millicent is trying to shut down the library and the bookstore and all this other stuff because she believes that she and only she should be able to decide what people will read. And that's what it is. And we talk about, when you start banning books, what you're ultimately doing is you're banning people. You're deciding who gets to speak and who will not be allowed to speak, and which stories we will listen to and which stories will be forbidden. And that's what that's all about. So that's basically the book in a nutshell, without too many spoilers.
I think you left out to me, what felt like a critical foundational piece, and that's the history of his parents.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm trying to leave something for the readers here, Vic. Come on.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough.
No. Well, that's one of those things that they discover that so early in the book. That's not like a spoiler alert. It's not like saying, "Oh, and he dies in the end," which he doesn't. Okay, by the way, but that kind of thing. And his parents were screenwriters in Hollywood, and they ended up being called into the McCarthy hearings, and they ultimately were blacklisted and lost their career. And that's when they were forced, more or less, to move to Arkansas and restart their lives. A lot of people went through that in the 1950s, the whole McCarthy thing. They couldn't write anymore. They couldn't get hired as screenwriters, and so they ended up selling books in a bookstore.
And I would say that even though they are not the central characters, I would say throughout the book, they still play a very large role in the book, in my mind. That's the way I read it.
Yeah, and I wanted them to have a presence. I didn't want to just, I don't know if you've ever read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but
I did.
There's a scene in there where a whale drops through the sky, has a few, existential thoughts, and then splatters all over the ground. I didn't want to make those guys a whale where they just showed up, served a purpose and then disappeared. So I tried to keep them around either in the background or in some cases right up front for the rest of the story.
Yeah. Well, you nailed it.
Thank you.
And now back to my review. So not only do I remember the characters, but as I was reading it, I found, I don't know, a year or two ago, I saw some kind of chart explaining how a good book is supposed to be. It was kind of like a curve, like a grading curve, where this is supposed to happen, and this is supposed to happen at the top, the climax, and then it showed a steeper drop off to the end. And one of the things that I thought made your book memorable and good for me was there wasn't, yes, there was the climax, but at the same time, there was a lot of hills and valleys, except the hills weren't something that you didn't want to be there. You wanted those, or the valleys rather. The valleys for me was, how do I explain it? I'm not an author.
A fundamentalist, a modernist, and a postmodernist walk into a bar. The bartender is a metamodernist, and he says, "You guys realize this is a joke, right?" So I wanted to see how a fundamentalist, I wanted to look at book banning from those 4 different perspectives. From the perspective of being a fundamentalist, which is Millicent Spate, of being a modernist, which is the dad, George, from being a postmodernist, which is the mother, Tammy, and for being a metamodernist, which is where Teresa's coming from.
Where do we put Jeremiah in that?
Jeremiah doesn't know what he believes. Jeremiah is searching for all this. In a very real way, Jeremiah is me. And he doesn't know exactly how he feels about book burning. He can understand why some things and some people might have a legitimate argument on some of these cases. On the other hand, his father is a free speech absolutist who thinks that people should be able to read whatever they choose. And I also understand that position. I tend to lean that way too. So Jeremiah is kind of figuring his way out along the way. The biggest problem for Jeremiah is that he's inherited a legacy he doesn't know if he wants to have.
Kind of like George Bailey.
George Bailey, you talking about
It's a Wonderful Life.
Wonderful Life?
Yeah.
Yeah, George Bailey, yeah, to a certain extent, he doesn't look back at his life and try to figure out what it would be like if he never existed. But he does wonder. I mean, there's a line in there where he's holding his son. Jeremiah has a child fairly early in the book. And he's holding his son, and he says, "I didn't choose this legacy. My parents chose this for me." And his friend looks at him and says, "Well, what kind of legacy are you choosing for your son?"
Yeah,
Which I think,
that line.
A lot of us think about that kind of stuff. What kind of legacies were handed to us? What are we handing off to the people that come next?
Yeah. And just so you know, I relate a lot of things in life to George Bailey. Okay. I want to be George Bailey.
Really? So, okay.
Yeah.
Do you have Zuzu's petals there in your pocket or something?
Yeah. I mean, I even mentioned in one of my videos that when I kick the bucket, I hope that I can come back and look at the world and see whether or not I made a difference and whether it was a good difference or a bad difference.
I'd like to do that before I kick the bucket at some point, but yeah, I understand what you're saying. On
just in case.
Yeah.
So this is a political podcast, and we talked a little bit about politics, but one of the other things that I really liked about your book was, as I was reading it, there were things going on in today's America that was popping out at me just like this. I did think of Florida a few times when I was reading your book and DeSantis and some of the stuff he's doing. I did think about, in his second job. I'm trying not to put spoilers in there, but in the second job where he was managing that other place.
I had to think what you were talking about for a minute.
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha.
That really spoke to me about, just my town. You go into a place and we know which businesses are MAGA businesses and which ones aren't. It's not that hard to tell.
No.
And I'm guessing in your town, there's 2 businesses that aren't.
Well, there's the bookstore, which is not.
Yeah, imagine that.
Imagine that. Susan Kreitz, and there are some, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 others that are Democrat friendly. But man, it's predominantly red. I mean, these guys will put, these billboard sized Trump posters in their front parking lot. It's pretty much Trump country here.
What about the next book? Do you know what it is yet?
Oh, yeah. I am 20,000 words into it. It's totally different. I want to go back and say one more thing about The Bookseller's Son, if I could, real fast.
Oh, yeah. We can keep talking about that.
Okay. No, I appreciate you asking about my next stuff, and I certainly want to get to that. But in The Bookseller's Son, I set it in the 1970s because I wanted to avoid that whole ripped from the headlines kind of feel. I
Makes
wanted to
sense.
put distance between the book and what's going on today. One of the problems with The Banned Room was it is a very present book. That book was written in 2020 while we were home for the pandemic. That's how that book came about to be. So that book, and it refers to all the things that were going on at that time, Black Lives Matters and all the protests and everything else that was going on at that time. I thought that was important, but that book has aged since then. And those, while the themes are universal, the events are not necessarily universal anymore. People don't have recall of that, and that's going to fade over time, unfortunately. So I didn't want to write a book that was dated. I didn't want to get into some of the issues surrounding book bans that took away from the core issue, which was censorship and the banning of books. So that's why I said it in the 1970s. I said it in rural Arkansas because from the time I was 6 until the time I was 15, I lived there. I mean, I know that country. I know those people. I know all that stuff. And there are some references in that story that are directly out of my life and my experiences. That El Camino scene where she's talking about she's riding in the back of her dad's El Camino, holding down the tarp while he's out. Yeah, I did that.
Yeah.
I was that kid. I spent a summer with my grandfather, and we drove up. It was a dry county. We drove up to Missouri, loaded up enough booze for the entire retirement village there. And he said, "You sit in the back and hold down the tarp." And there we went, So it was kind of it was fun to write from that aspect of the geography.
My friend Bob was a bootlegger.
Yeah. Yeah. I used to say,
that's cool.
When I was teaching, I had a kid tell me, "You just don't understand rednecks, Mr. C. You just don't understand redneck culture." And I said,
if only he knew.
If only. You don't get more redneck than riding in the back of an El Camino smuggling, whiskey across the Missouri border. You know what I mean?
Before you sent me the book to read, we were talking, and you were talking about how when you were researching it, the idea of book bans and censorship isn't just a red issue, if you will. Speak to that a little bit.
I assumed, because I'm a liberal and progressive guy, and we all assume, we define normal as what is normal for us. And so I assumed that book banning was all about the right wing, And when I got into this, I realized that there are a lot of progressives who are behind a lot of book bans. To Kill a Mockingbird is a powerful book, an important book. And yet there are people on the left who would ban that book because of its use of certain words. Huckleberry Finn is I think the first novel that was written on a typewriter, if that's any use to anybody. But Huckleberry Finn is a great American novel that happens to contain language that was used at the time.
And at the time, it was societally permissible. Or is that a word? Societally?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. It was the language of the day. And so when Mark Twain refers to the character Jim, he always has the N word in front of it. By the way, there's a really good book called James, and I cannot remember who wrote it, that is written from the perspective of Jim. And it's a good book to read. It just came out a few years ago. It's really good. Anyway, so liberals are more likely to ban books that they consider to be offensive to certain groups. And I was surprised by the extent to which that happened, honestly.
Yeah, it's always nice to step back a little bit sometimes and look at our own faults and foibles while we're judging
you have
others
to.
for
Otherwise,
theirs.
you get trapped in the bubble and you think that, we're perfect and they're not. And that's what led to a lot of our problems today.
Yeah. Then we're both in different cults.
Yeah. Yeah, to some extent. Some cults
I try to stay out of the cult mentality.
Yeah, cults are hard, Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What else do we need to know about the book without giving away any spoilers?
First of all, I appreciate you reading it, and I would like for people to read it. I will also say this. I write literary fiction. That's the official genre of, that's how you classify a book like The Bookseller's Son. Literary fiction. 30% of all fiction that's purchased are romance novels. And another 30% is mysteries.
You started to dip into that romance novel bit. Just you were getting close to going there, I could tell.
I that was a surprise to me. I had this character that honestly started as a throwaway. I just, it was more of a prop really than a character. And the more I got into it, I thought this has some potential. And then around, I don't know, towards the middle of the book, I dropped this big one-line surprise that I really would get ticked off about if somebody put that in a review. You know, dropped this big bomb, and then that changed everything. And then I had to think, okay, you've got a person here who grew up in an extremely religious household, and I wanted to respect that. It would have been really easy the first time that she and Jeremiah faced a crisis together for them to end up sleeping together. That would have been an easy thing you could justify it, you could write it, it would have fit the narrative, it would have been a great thing. But I wanted to show respect for the character, and that character, maybe you disagree, but I don't think that character would have done that. I mean,
I agree.
she's sitting in that church alone, having basically a crisis of faith and trying to figure out how to do all this stuff. And I wanted to respect her. I kind of fell in love with Teresa as I was writing her. I mean, I wanted good for her, and I wanted her to be her own character. And that became she's like probably my second favorite character in the novel, but I really liked writing her.
I think the way that you handled that relationship between the two of them is a testament to how good the book is, because the story, how good the story is, because while some people were expecting it, while I was sitting there wondering when I turned the page, is this what I'm going to get to? And it never did. And it didn't have to. It wasn't necessary. But so much of our entertainment these days is going straight for it. But the story was complete without throwing that in.
Well, I mean, the
I
book
hope we're
starts with
being
a
vague
sex
enough
scene.
and not too vague.
The
Yeah.
very first scene in the book is he's in bed with this woman, right? The very first scene. So I'm not completely innocent there, although I didn't get graphic. But
No.
but I had to respect that character. What I was going to say when I was giving off the stats about literary stuff, I don't write. If you're reading one of my books and you're looking for car chases and you know bombs blowing up and all that other stuff, you're going to be sorely disappointed. I don't do that. I'm more interested in how people grow and how people develop and the internal challenges that they face. To me, external challenges like losing your job is secondary to the internal challenge that you deal with in that situation. That's what I'm interested in, and that's what I write about.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was the other thing I was going to mention in our conversations before I read it. You were talking about how maybe you might have to write a book that has more car chases and explosions, but I absolutely unnecessary for the way you write. Um, you again, one of the other things that tells me whether or not the book is good is when I start reading it, do I have to look at my clock to make sure that I'm not gonna be late for something because I got into it and I can't wait to turn the next page. And that's how I was when I started reading your book. I was immediately grabbed and I was into the story, wondering what's going to happen next. If that doesn't happen when I'm reading a book, then it's not that good a book. It might be a fair book, but it's not one that I'm going to put on the bookshelf. This is one I definitely want to put on the bookshelf.
Yeah.
You're an independent author. You're not backed by the big New York City publishers and stuff. So when somebody buys your book, not only do they get a really good story, but they're also supporting an independent writer.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I thought about, and I'll be honest, I would love to be published by one of the major houses, but that takes like 2 years. Plus, I feel like for self-published guys like me, it's just a more democratic process. You don't have gatekeepers deciding what's going to go out there and what's not. I talk about that in Bookseller's Son about, not only people like Millicent Spate are the obvious censors. We know they're bad and they go out there and they do stuff. But what about the publishers that decide not to publish a book? What about the bookstores that decide not to carry a book? What about all these other people and that whole supply chain that make those decisions that between the reader and the writer, there's a whole lot of people between there that decide who gets to see this material. And so with me, I feel like it's more direct. It's the same thing that happened with independent musicians. People going out there, putting out their own stuff on YouTube or whatever. And I think books are headed in that same direction right now. I hope.
I started to ask you about your next book.
Oh, the next book, I don't have a title for it yet. It's about a guy who he works for the algorithm compliance division of this city, right? He is a landscape compliance officer. And so if you have a, forbidden type of grass in your yard, he's the guy who's going to send you, the notification for that. And he has this epiphany one day at a company retreat that he doesn't want to be doing this anymore. This is not what it is. And so he becomes a dog walker. He starts just walking people's dogs. I set this up. The town that I modeled that dystopian sort of AI controlled environment, that algorithm controlled environment, I based that on Parker because my son got into a fight with his HOA when he wanted to paint his house. And so he had to deal with that. And I put adjacent to that, this guy now, after he quit his job, he's living on a ranch out in northern Elbert County. So you've got that whole rural aspect of that going on, which is obviously you don't have an HOA out in Elbert County. And I'm focusing on a managed, planned community versus people who just live their lives. You want to plant a tree, whatever, So that's where this is. And like I said, I'm 20,000 words in, which is probably about a third. Bookseller's Son is 105,000 words. I'm not going to do that again for a while. But this one,
it didn't feel like it was that long.
Well, thank you. That's good. That's a good thing. I'm glad.
It was over almost as soon as I started it. It seemed like it was a shorter. It left me wondering what happens next.
Well, that's kind of the intent there. I like those kinds of, I love the movie Inception because you really don't know what's going to happen there. And it's kind of the same idea. I like books that leave open endings.
I hate them because I don't know what's going to happen next. I want to give you one more chance to say anything else about your very excellent book, The Bookseller's Son. Anything else that you want to say about it before we go?
I'm really happy with this book. I think it addresses issues that are important to Americans and to American culture right now. I think we need to come together and recognize that free speech applies to everyone. It doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. If you support free speech, then you support free speech. This is not some kind of buffet system where you pick whatever you want to do. And The Bookseller's Son tries to address all those issues and bring it all together. And at the same time, I try to write a story that people would like. And I appreciate you reading it and your kind words.
Yeah. It was easy to give those kind words because they were well-deserved. All right, folks, I made a video about 4 or 5 months ago. It was before the election where I talked about the importance of protest music. And if you look back in the 60s in particular, but you can go back a lot farther than that. And protest music has played an important role in our politics. And I really I cherish good protest music. So one of my favorite protest musicians, although he's much more than a protest musician, is Billy Simons Jr. And he's going to be on next week, and we're going to talk about his music. He's also an author, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about his previous life before going full-time as a musician. But most importantly, we're going to talk about protest music and see where that goes. We're going to talk about it in relation to today's times. I hope you'll join me then. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to being back with you again. Good day.